Judy Garland would have given everything to have Lana Turner's beauty. Lana Turner would have given everything to have Judy Garland's talent. They started as friends, sharing secrets at the piano, but the studio used their deepest insecurities to turn them into enemies. This was never a simple story about a cat fight. It was the systematic destruction of a friendship by the men who owned them. To these power brokers, their pain was just a product, and their broken hearts were simply good for business. By 1938, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer had become more than a film studio. It was a totalitarian state wrapped in velvet. It was a factory that manufactured dreams by crushing the dreamers, and it had two very distinct product lines. On one assembly line, there was Judy Garland. Born Frances Gumm, she was a vaudeville veteran before she hit puberty. She possessed a talent so raw and electric that it frightened people. When she opened her mouth to sing, she channeled the collective grief of the human experience. Her voice possessed a raw, electric quality that frightened people. But to Louis B. Mayer, talent was secondary to optics. He looked at Judy, who stood barely 5 feet tall, with a curvature of the spine and a fluctuating waistline, and saw a problem to be solved rather than a star. He called her his little hunchback. While other teenage girls were navigating high school dances, Judy was navigating a chemical regimen designed to strip her of her autonomy. The studio doctors, on direct orders from the executive office, placed her on a diet of chicken soup, black coffee, and 80 cigarettes a day to suppress her appetite. When the hunger became unbearable, there were pills, Benzedrine to wake her up before dawn, and Seconal to knock her unconscious when the adrenaline refused to fade. She was 16 years old, trapped in a corset of expectations, starving in the land of plenty. On the adjacent assembly line, MGM was perfecting a very different model, Lana Turner. If Judy Garland was the voice of the soul, Lana Turner was the lust of the eye. Discovered, or so the legend goes, sipping a soda at the Top Hat Cafe, Lana was the sweater girl. She was the physical manifestation of what every man wanted and what every woman was terrified she wasn't. Lana simply had to exist. Singing and acting were secondary to her sheer presence. Her currency was a cool, detached glamour that seemed impervious to pain. The studio groomed her to be the goddess, the untouchable siren who glided through rooms while mortals stared. But the cruelty of the system lay in how it positioned these two women. They were not natural enemies. In fact, in the late 1930s, they were friends. They were neighbors in the labyrinth of Hollywood. Two young women surviving the same high-pressure ecosystem. There was a genuine, albeit fragile, affection between them. Judy would often play the piano at parties, losing herself in the music, while Lana would sit beside her, turning the pages, silently envious of a talent she knew she could never possess. Lana Turner, for all her visual perfection, lived in terror of being exposed as a fraud, a beauty with nothing behind the eyes. Judy Garland, for all her genius, would have traded every standing ovation for just one day of looking like Lana Turner. MGM knew this, and MGM exploited it. The studio created a binary universe. They whispered to Judy that she would never be as desirable as Lana. They whispered to Lana that she would never be as talented as Judy. It was a classic divide and conquer strategy, designed to keep both stars insecure, dependent, and desperate for the studio's validation. Mayer was the abusive father who pitted his daughters against one another, ensuring that neither would ever feel strong enough to leave the house. And then, into this carefully calibrated tension, walked Artie Shaw. Artie Shaw, a jazz intellectual and clarinet virtuoso, viewed Hollywood with thinly veiled contempt. Throughout 1939, Judy convinced herself she had found an escape, believing her connection with Shaw transcended Hollywood's superficial metrics. She thought he saw the soul behind the voice. Unfortunately, she projected her desperate need for acceptance onto a man who was essentially a tourist in her misery. Shaw was a man of paradoxes, despising glamour while being addicted to it, claiming to value intellect, yet discarding women the moment they bored him. While Judy poured her heart out, Shaw merely observed. He was a man who collected women like specimens, analyzing them, dissecting them, and ultimately discarding them when they failed to meet his impossible standards of intellectual purity. In his memoirs, Shaw's assessment was chillingly clinical. He viewed Judy as a pudgy, weird little girl, desperate for approval. He found her intensity exhausting and her neediness repulsive. He allowed her to adore him because it fed his ego, but he never respected her. To Shaw, Judy was just another symptom of the Hollywood disease he claimed to hate, a hysterical, manufactured creature who couldn't tell the difference between a movie script and real life. And then there was Lana. If Judy was the symptom of Hollywood, Lana Turner was the cure Artie Shaw didn't know he wanted? Or perhaps she was the ultimate hypocrisy he couldn't resist. Lana was filming Dancing Co-Ed with Shaw's band in 1939. At first, Shaw was dismissive of her. He saw her as the epitome of the vapid screen siren. Beautiful, yes, but empty. A sweater girl with nothing underneath the wool. But Shaw was a man of contradictions. He hated Hollywood glamour, yet he was magnetically drawn to it. He preached about depth, yet he was seduced by the surface. Lana Turner was terrifyingly beautiful in 1940. She was 19 years old at the absolute peak of her physical perfection. But like Judy, she was also a construct of the studio. MGM had plucked her from obscurity, dyed her hair platinum, and taught her how to walk, how to sit, how to breathe, to maximize her allure. But underneath the lacquer, Lana was lonely. She was a girl who had lost her father young, who had been thrust into a world of wolves, and who used her sexuality as a shield. She was intimidated by Artie Shaw. She thought he was brilliant. When he spoke to her, he didn't use the simple predatory language of the studio executives. He used big words. He challenged her. He made her feel that perhaps she wasn't just a body. Perhaps she could be smart too. The dynamic between the three of them was a silent, festering wound throughout the early months of 1940. Judy, blinded by her own infatuation, didn't see the shift. She didn't see the way Shaw's eyes lingered on Lana when the cameras weren't rolling. She didn't realize that in the cruel calculus of Artie Shaw's mind, she was the friend and Lana was the prize. Judy thought her shared passion for music was the bond that would hold them together. She didn't understand that for a man like Shaw, music was work. He didn't want a partner who understood his work. He wanted a distraction that made him forget it. The catastrophe happened on a Tuesday night in February. It was a date that wasn't supposed to be a date. Artie Shaw called Lana Turner. He didn't call Judy. It was a simple decision, a whim seemingly innocuous. But in the volatile atmosphere of Hollywood, it was the strike of a match in a room full of gasoline. They went to dinner. The conversation was not about jazz theory or the existential dread of fame. It was frantic, charged, and impulsive. Shaw, perhaps bored with his own brooding intellect, found something intoxicating in Lana's raw, unpretentious beauty. Lana, perhaps desperate to prove she could land the smartest man in Hollywood, found herself swept up in his intensity. It was a romance, born not of deep connection, but of mutual defiance. For Shaw, marrying Lana Turner was a way to give the finger to the intellectual elite who expected him to marry a poet or a scholar. It was an act of punk rock rebellion before the term existed. For Lana, it was a way to escape the suffocating control of her mother in the studio, to prove she was a woman who could make her own choices. Without waiting or considering the collateral damage, they drove to Las Vegas that very night. The drive across the desert was the funeral procession for Judy Garland's youth. While Judy sat in her bedroom in Bel Air, perhaps staring at the telephone, perhaps waiting for the sleeping pills to kick in, imagining a future where Artie Shaw would finally propose, the man of her dreams was racing toward the Nevada border with the woman she considered her friend. The betrayal was absolute because it was so casual. It wasn't a calculated plot to hurt Judy. It was worse. It was a total erasure of her existence. In the heat of their impulse, neither Artie nor Lana gave a single thought to the girl with the golden voice. She simply didn't factor into the equation of desire. The news broke the next morning with the violence of a physical blow. What should have been a private conversation became a headline plastered across every paper in America. The king of swing weds the sweater girl. Judy Garland found out like the rest of the world. The shock was physiological. It was a rejection so total, so public, that it confirmed every poison whisper Louis B. Mayer had ever poured into her ear. In her devastated mind, the logic was irrefutable. She had the talent and the soul, but he chose the face and the body. The sun rose on February 9th, bringing with it the realization that for all her talent, for all the tears she wrung from audiences, in The Wizard of Oz she was, in the romantic calculus of the real world, utterly insignificant. She didn't just cry, she disintegrated. The fragile scaffolding of her self-esteem, held together by pills and hope, collapsed instantly. But in the ecosystem of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, grief was a luxury Judy Garland could not afford. A normal teenager might have stayed home from school, eaten ice cream, and cried into her pillow. Judy Garland had a 6 a.m. call time. She had a contract. She had a studio that viewed her emotions not as feelings, but as fuel. Louis B. Mayer, the titan of MGM, did not rush to comfort his little hunchback. He did not offer her time off to heal. Instead, he summoned her to his office, the Iron Lung, as some called it, a cavernous sanctum designed to make anyone standing on the other side of his massive desk feel like an ant. Mayer knew exactly what he was doing. He had been waiting for a moment like this. For years, he had struggled to keep Judy's weight down and her ego in check. He needed her to be insecure, because an insecure star is a compliant star. A confident Judy might demand better pay, fewer hours, or the right to choose her own songs. A broken Judy would do anything to please him. The meeting that followed was a master class in psychological abuse. Mayer didn't just acknowledge the heartbreak. He weaponized it. He reportedly used the elopement as empirical proof of the toxic gospel he had been preaching to her since she was 12. You see, Judy, the subtext of his lecture went, you see what happens? You are not Lana. You will never be Lana. Men like Artie Shaw play with girls like you, but they marry girls like her. Why? Because she is beautiful, because she is a goddess. You are a singer. You are a clown. You are here to work, not to be loved. He took the knife Artie Shaw had plunged into her back and twisted it. He validated the rejection. He confirmed that the fault lay not in Shaw's fickleness, but in Judy's inherent inadequacy. He framed her talent, the very thing that made her a genius, as a consolation prize for her lack of sexual allure. He told her, in so many words that her voice was the only thing that justified her existence, and that without the studio's protection, without his protection, she would be unlovable. Judy left that office not with a resolved heart, but with a confirmed pathology. If she couldn't be beautiful, she would have to be perfect. If she couldn't be loved for her womanhood, she would have to be worshipped for her performance. She returned to the set, her eyes swollen, her hands trembling, and threw herself into her work with a terrifying manic intensity. And then the press arrived. If Mayer was the judge, the Hollywood fan magazines were the executioners. Publications like Photoplay, Modern Screen, and Motion Picture descended on the story with the voracious appetite of vultures. In 1940, these magazines were the social media of their day, powerful, pervasive, and capable of shaping reality. They needed a narrative. Boy Meets Girl was boring. Boy dumps talented plain girl for sex symbol was gold. They dissected the triangle with a cruelty that masked itself as analysis. Articles appeared with titles that speculated on why Lana won. They pitted the two women against each other in a public coliseum. They analyzed Lana's oomph, her sex appeal, her mystery. They contrasted it with Judy's pep, her energy, her girl-next-door charm. The language was coded but clear. Lana was the woman you desired. Judy was the pal you took to a malt shop. One article in Photoplay went so far as to publish a scientific breakdown of charm, suggesting that men ultimately required the visual fantasy that Lana provided, implying that Judy's intensity was off-putting to the male psyche. Judy read every word. She was obsessed. She pored over the magazines in her dressing room, tracing the lines of Lana's face in the photographs, looking at her own reflection in the mirror, and seeing only flaws. The media didn't just report the news. They turned her heartbreak into a national referendum on her desirability. Millions of strangers were reading about her humiliation. Millions of strangers were nodding in agreement. Yes, of course he chose Lana. Look at her. This public autopsy of her love life drove Judy deeper into the arms of the only thing that never judged her, the chemicals. The studio doctors, seeing her distress, didn't suggest therapy. They suggested a dosage adjustment. If she was depressed, they had a pill for that. If she couldn't sleep because the image of Artie and Lana haunted her nightmares, they had a pill for that. If she was too groggy to dance the next morning, they had a shot for that. The Benzedrine usage spiked. Judy wasn't just taking them to work anymore, she was taking them to feel. The amphetamines gave her a false sense of power, a synthetic confidence that allowed her to stand in front of a camera and belt out a song with ferocity. But the crash was inevitable. The seconal at night became a black hole she gladly jumped into. It was during this period, the spring of 1940, that the Judy Garland the world knows, the tragic, trembling, pill-popping diva, began to truly form. Before Artie Shaw, the drugs were a requirement of the job. After Artie Shaw, they became a requirement of survival. They were the only way to silence the voice in her head that sounded suspiciously like Louis B. Mayer, repeating over and over that she wasn't enough. Meanwhile, across town, the victor was realizing that her prize was a poisoned chalice. Lana Turner, now Mrs. Artie Shaw, was living in a hell of her own making. The honeymoon phase had lasted approximately 48 hours. The reality of being married to Artie Shaw was a punishing ordeal. Shaw was not the romantic hero of the magazines. He was a controlling, misogynistic intellectual who viewed his new wife as a project. He banned her from wearing makeup in the house. He threw out her shoes because he found them vulgar. He dictated what books she should read and then mocked her when she didn't understand them. Lana, the goddess who had supposedly won the war, was being systematically dismantled in her own living room. She was terrified of him. She was terrified of the press finding out that her fairy tale marriage was a sham. She had humiliated her friend Judy to get this man, and now she was trapped with him. The guilt and the shame began to erode her own confidence. She started to believe Shaw's insults, that she was just a dumb blonde, a pretty face with no soul. But the public didn't see this. The public saw only the photos of the happy couple at the coconut grove. Judy saw the photos. And in the twisted logic of her pain, she didn't see Lana's fear. She saw only her own failure. Mayer, watching from his tower, saw the dailies. He saw Judy's eyes looking a little wilder, her frame a little thinner, her performance a little more desperate. And he smiled. The dailies were good. The pain was translating to film. The breakdown was profitable. He decided it was time to turn the screw one more time. He didn't just want Judy to read about Lana. He wanted her to stand next to her. He wanted to put the ugly duckling and the swan in the same frame and let the camera record the carnage. He began the pre-production for Ziegfeld Girl. He cast Judy Garland. He cast Lana Turner. He cast Hedy Lamarr. It was a casting decision that bordered on sadism. He was placing Judy in a direct side-by-side comparison with the two most beautiful women in the world. He was inviting the audience to compare them. He was inviting Judy to destroy herself, trying to compete. The stage was set for the next act of the tragedy. The betrayal was over, the war of attrition was about to begin, and the weapon of choice would be a costume fitting, a lighting rig, and a script that mirrored reality so closely it would draw blood. The system had successfully broken Judy's heart. Now it was coming for her sanity. If the elopement of Artie Shaw and Lana Turner was the initial explosion, the spring of 1940 was the radioactive fallout. The debris didn't settle. It was gathered up, repackaged, and sold on newsstands for 10 cents a copy. In the weeks following the betrayal, Judy Garland entered a phase of existence that can only be described as a public flaying. The Hollywood press, that hydra-headed monster led by gossip columnists like Luella Parsons and Hedda Hopper, did not let the story die. They understood that tragedy sells better than triumph. They constructed a narrative binary that would haunt Judy for the rest of her life, the girl next door versus the goddess. On the surface, the articles were sympathetic to Judy. "Poor little Judy," they crooned, "the girl who got left behind." But the subtext was a sledgehammer to the ego of a 17-year-old girl. By constantly framing her as the pal, the buddy, the sister, they were essentially desexualizing her in front of the entire world. They were telling every man in America and reminding Artie Shaw that Judy Garland was safe, reliable, and fundamentally unexciting. In contrast, they painted Lana Turner as dangerous, intoxicating, and irresistible. For Judy, who was desperately trying to transition from child star to leading lady, this was professional and personal poison. She didn't want to be the girl next door. She wanted to be the woman in the bedroom. She wanted the oomph that Lana possessed. But the studio system, reinforcing the media narrative, told her, "Stay in your lane." Louis B. Mayer, observing the media frenzy, saw an opportunity to tighten the screws. He didn't shield Judy from these comparisons. He curated them. He needed Judy to feel less than. A star who believes she is lucky just to be allowed in the room is a star who will work 18 hours a day without complaint. He used the press as a mirror, forcing Judy to look at a reflection that was distorted by his own cruel design. The pressure manifested in the one area of her life Mayer controlled with obsessive precision: her weight. The narrative of Judy the Ugly Duckling gave Mayer the license to escalate her starvation. If Artie Shaw left her because she wasn't glamorous enough, then the solution, in Mayer's twisted logic, was to starve the glamour into her. The diet became a regimen of torture. The commissary staff at MGM were given strict orders. Judy Garland was to be served nothing but chicken broth, cottage cheese, and black coffee. The psychological violence was absolute. Judy was working on the most expensive sets in the world, surrounded by fake feasts and prop food, while her own stomach gnawed at her spine. She was surrounded by people, extras, crew members, executives, who ate sandwiches and donuts in front of her. Food became the enemy. It became the symbol of everything she was denied: comfort, autonomy, pleasure. To suppress the appetite that naturally comes to a growing teenager, the studio doctors increased the Benzedrine. The pills weren't just pep anymore. They were a chemical anorexia. They killed the hunger, but they replaced it with a hollow, vibrating anxiety. Judy began to vibrate with a frantic energy. Her eyes widened. Her speech quickened. She was disappearing physically, shedding pounds until her ribs showed through her costumes. But emotionally, she was becoming a heavy, volatile mass of insecurity. And then came the birthday party, June 10th, 1940. Judy Garland turned 18. In the eyes of the law, she was an adult. In the eyes of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, she was a chattel. The studio decided to throw her a party. It was not a celebration of her life, it was a publicity stunt. It was held at the studio, or a studio-approved venue, designed to show the world that the MGM family loved their little Judy. The guest list was a who's who of Hollywood royalty. The decorations were lavish. The press was invited to document the joyous occasion. But for the birthday girl, it was a nightmare in Technicolor. The centerpiece of the party was a massive, beautiful cake. It was a masterpiece of sugar and cream, a symbol of sweetness and celebration. But before the first flashbulb popped, Louis B. Mayer, or one of his lieutenants, leaned in and whispered the rules. "You can blow out the candles, Judy, but you cannot eat the cake." While it sounds like a petty detail, this moment encapsulates the entire tragedy. Here is a girl who has just been publicly humiliated by the man she loved. She is working herself to the bone to please a father figure who calls her a hunchback. She is starving, and on the one day that is supposed to be about her, she is surrounded by people feasting on her cake while she is forbidden to taste it. Witnesses from the era, and later biographers, recount the scene with a chilling clarity. Judy stood there, smiling that famous crinkling smile for the photographers. She held the knife, she cut the slices, she served the guests. She watched them eat. She watched the icing melt on their tongues. She watched the crumbs fall to the plates. And when she thought no one was looking, in a moment of desperate animal hunger, she reached out. Maybe it was for a cookie on a side table. Maybe it was for a smudge of frosting on the knife. A hand shot out. It wasn't a gentle correction. It was a sharp, humiliating slap or a forceful grip on her wrist. A studio handler, one of the spies Mayer paid to shadow her, intervened. "No, Judy. Think of the figure." The room didn't go silent. The party continued. The laughter didn't stop. The music kept playing. But in that second, something inside Judy Garland snapped. It was the realization that she had no agency. She was 18 years old, a world-famous millionaire, and she couldn't eat a damn cookie at her own birthday party. The humiliation was total. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the powerlessness. It was a reminder that her body did not belong to her. It belonged to the shareholders of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. It belonged to the box office receipts. It belonged to the phantom image of Judy that they were selling to the public. Lana Turner was likely not the one slapping her hand, but her specter was in the room. The implicit threat was always her. If you get fat, Judy, you're useless. Lana doesn't have to starve to be beautiful. You do. That night, after the party ended, after the guests went home to their real lives, Judy went home to her empty room. The hunger was still there, a sharp physical pain in her gut. But the emotional pain was worse. It was the hollow ache of being a prop in your own life. She didn't reach for leftovers. She reached for the bottle on her nightstand. Seconal, 1 to sleep, 2 to forget the cake, 3 to forget the way Mayer looked at her, 4 to stop the spinning in her head. The setup for her destruction was no longer theoretical. It was chemical. The studio had successfully fused her self-worth to her weight and her weight to her drug intake. They had created a closed loop of abuse. Meanwhile, the rivalry was about to move from the gossip columns to the soundstage. Mayer had seen the headlines. He saw the public's fascination with the Judy versus Lana narrative. He decided to cash in. The script for Ziegfeld Girl was finalized. It was a sprawling musical melodrama about 3 showgirls trying to make it on Broadway. The casting was a masterstroke of cynicism. Lana Turner was cast as Sheila Regan, the stunning beauty from a poor background who rises to fame on her looks but destroys herself with alcohol and bad men. Judy Garland was cast as Susan Gallagher, the talented vaudevillian father-daughter act who makes it on pure talent but struggles with feeling overshadowed. Hedy Lamarr was cast as the third lead, the steady, beautiful intellectual. The cruelty was calculated. Mayer wasn't asking them to act. He was forcing them to reenact their own traumas. He was asking Lana to play out her fear of being just a beauty who ruins her life. He was asking Judy to play out her fear of being the talented, ugly one. He was putting them in a cage together, turning on the lights, and waiting to see who would bleed first. As the summer of 1940 turned into autumn, the pre-production began. Judy was terrified. She knew she would have to stand next to Lana Turner day after day, frame after frame. She knew the camera would be merciless. She knew the crew would be comparing them. She ramped up the diet. She ramped up the pills. She looked in the mirror and didn't see a star. She saw a soldier preparing for a war she was already losing. The girl next door was dead. In her place was a frightened, starving young woman, armed with a bottle of amphetamines, walking toward the brightest lights in the world, hoping they would blind her to the darkness closing in. The production of Ziegfeld Girl in late 1940 was not merely a film shoot. It was a gladiatorial combat staged in chiffon and sequins. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, under the directive of Louis B. Mayer, had constructed a physical environment designed to maximize the insecurities of its 2 young stars. The set was a sprawling, suffocating masterpiece of Art Deco excess. Massive staircases that spiraled into nowhere, curtains of shimmering beads that weighed hundreds of pounds, and lighting rigs so hot they could melt the makeup off a face in minutes. Into this terrarium, Mayer placed Judy Garland and Lana Turner, locking the door behind them. For Judy, walking onto stage 27 was an exercise in daily humiliation. The studio had positioned the film as a tribute to the legendary showgirls of the 1920s, a premise that inherently prioritized physical perfection over musical ability. The narrative centered on 3 women, the regal Hedy Lamarr, the sultry Lana Turner, and the talented but visually distinct Judy Garland. Every camera angle, every costume fitting, and every lighting setup was a reinforcement of the hierarchy Mayer had established. The costume designer, Adrian, a genius of fabric and form, was inadvertently drafted into this psychological warfare. For Lana, Adrian designed gowns that were architectural marvels of seduction, white satin that clung to the skin like water, plunging necklines that defied gravity, and furs that framed her face like a halo. When Lana stepped out of the dressing room, the crew stopped. The silence wasn't just respect, it was a collective intake of breath. She was the Ziegfeld girl incarnate, a creature so impossibly beautiful that she seemed to be backlit by God himself. For Judy, the wardrobe was different. It was character clothing. It was designed to look slightly less expensive, slightly less fitted, slightly more approachable. While Lana was being draped in diamonds, Judy was being put in gingham and sensible wool. The visual language was screaming, "Here is the goddess, and here is the mortal who serves her." Judy felt this disparity in her marrow. She was starving herself on the studio-mandated diet of chicken soup and cigarettes, swallowing Benzedrine to keep her energy up. Yet she stood next to Lana and felt like a gargoyle. She would watch the cinematographer, Ray June, spend hours lighting Lana. They used scrims, diffusers, and specific key lights to make Lana's skin look like porcelain. When it was Judy's turn, the lights were harsher, the setup quicker. She became convinced that the camera itself was judging her, that the lens was a microscope magnifying every flaw Mayer had pointed out in his office. But the cruelty of the situation was binary. If Judy was suffering from the feeling of being less than, Lana Turner was suffering from the terror of being only that. Lana arrived on set each morning carrying the invisible wreckage of her marriage to Artie Shaw. The victory of winning him had turned into a domestic prison. Shaw, the intellectual snob, was systematically dismantling her ego at home, telling her she was vapid, uneducated, and embarrassing. He forbade her from reading trashy magazines and mocked her attempts to understand his highbrow literature. When Lana walked onto the set of Ziegfeld Girl, she wasn't strutting, she was fleeing. She needed the validation of the crew's gaze because it was the only place she felt powerful. However, standing next to Judy Garland terrified her. Lana knew with a sinking dread that beauty was a depreciating asset. She watched Judy rehearse. She saw the raw, terrifying talent that poured out of the little hunchback. Judy didn't just sing. She tore the roof off the sound stage. She had a timing, a wit, and an emotional depth that no amount of lighting could manufacture. Lana looked at Judy and saw the one thing Artie Shaw respected: genius. She felt like an imposter, a coat hanger for Adrian's dresses, waiting for the world to realize she had nothing to offer but a waistline. The tension on set was palpable. The crew walked on eggshells. The press, allowed on set to observe, scribbled notes about the chilly atmosphere. They were writing the script of a catfight before a word was spoken. And then there was the piano incident. It is a moment often lost in the broader history of the film, but it is crucial to understanding the tragedy of their relationship. During a break in filming, the tension had reached a breaking point. Lana, feeling particularly insecure after a difficult scene where she struggled with her lines, decided to assert her dominance. She sat down at the grand piano on the set. It was a prop, but a functional one. She began to play a simple, halting melody, perhaps chopsticks or a basic exercise she had learned as a child. It was a clumsy attempt to show that she too had musicality. She too had depth. The crew watched, uncomfortable. It was like watching a child try to fly a plane. Judy Garland watched from the shadows. She could have mocked her. She could have laughed. It would have been the easy, petty victory. Instead, she walked over. She didn't push Lana off the bench. She sat down next to her. Judy placed her hands on the keys. She didn't play a simple tune. She unleashed a torrent of jazz improvisation, a complex, soulful, virtuoso performance that filled the cavernous soundstage. Her fingers flew across the ivory, channeling all the frustration, the hunger and the heartbreak of the last year into the music. It was aggressive, it was beautiful, and it was undeniable. Lana Turner stopped playing. She pulled her hands into her lap. She sat there frozen, staring at Judy's hands. In that moment, the mask of the Ice Queen cracked. Lana didn't storm off. She didn't throw a tantrum. She looked at Judy with an expression that wasn't jealousy. It was awe. It was the look of someone witnessing a force of nature. For the first time, the goddess bowed to the talent. For a flickering second, the wall Louis B. Mayer had built between them crumbled. They were just two scared girls, victims of the same man, Shaw, and the same master, Mayer, recognizing the prison they were in. Judy saw Lana's fear. Lana saw Judy's pain. They could have been allies. They could have formed a coalition of the damaged. But the moment was interrupted. A director shouted, "Cut," or "Places." The machinery of the studio roared back to life. The lights slammed back on. The makeup artists rushed in to touch up Lana's powder. The handlers pulled Judy away to give her another pill. The truce was over. The system didn't allow for solidarity. It required competition. The film itself, Ziegfeld Girl, captures this tragedy in code. There is a specific musical number that stands as the emotional centerpiece of the movie and perhaps of Judy Garland's entire early career. I'm Always Chasing Rainbows. In the pivotal scene, Judy sits alone as the character Susan Gallagher. The lighting is moody, isolating her from the glittering world of the Follies. She sings, "I'm always chasing rainbows, watching clouds drifting by. My schemes are just like all my dreams, ending in the sky." This was not acting. This was autobiography. When Judy sang those lyrics in 1940, she was singing about Artie Shaw. She was singing about the phantom normalcy she craved but could never touch. She was singing about the rainbow of happiness that Lana Turner seemed to have caught, not realizing that Lana's rainbow was made of neon gas and broken glass. The performance is devastating because of its context. Judy was high on amphetamines during the recording sessions, her heart racing at twice the normal speed, yet her voice is controlled, mournful, and ancient. She is channeling the exhaustion of the setup. She is telling the audience, "I am trying, I am running as fast as I can, but I cannot catch them." Mayer loved it. He reportedly watched the dailies of that number and wept. The irony is grotesque. The man who was causing the pain was crying at the beauty of the pain's expression. He saw the tears in Judy's eyes and saw dollar signs. He saw her trembling lip and saw an Oscar nomination. He didn't see a girl on the brink of collapse. He saw a product functioning exactly as designed. As filming progressed, the physical toll on Judy became impossible to hide. The diet was failing to keep her weight stable because her metabolism was in chaos. She would binge, eat in secret, consumed by shame, and then starve herself for days. The costumes had to be constantly altered. The wardrobe mistresses would whisper. The gossip would travel up to the executive offices. Lana, meanwhile, was beginning to disintegrate in her own way. Her marriage to Artie Shaw was entering its terminal phase. The man she had stolen from Judy was now openly hostile to her. He would visit the set, not to support his wife, but to critique the filmmaking process. He would ignore Lana to talk to the director or the musicians. By the time Ziegfeld Girl wrapped to production, the damage was calcified. The film would go on to be a massive hit. Critics would praise Lana's beauty and Judy's pathos. The studio would pat itself on the back for a successful pairing. But for the two young women, the film was a tomb. It marked the end of their friendship and the beginning of their respective descents. Lana had learned that her beauty was a trap. She had to maintain it to be loved. but it attracted men who despised her for it. Judy had learned that her talent was a curse. It required her to bleed to be applauded, and no amount of applause would ever make her feel beautiful. They walked off the set of Ziegfeld Girl in different directions, but they were headed toward the same abyss. The lights of the sound stage faded, but the chase Judy sang about, the chase for worth, for love, for peace, was only just beginning. And the road ahead was paved with more pills, more bad men, and the relentless, unforgiving silence of a world that only loved them when they were suffering. If 1940 was the year of the heart's fracture, 1941 was the year of the soul's amputation. While the audiences of America were lining up to see Ziegfeld Girl, weeping over the fictional tragedies of showgirls, the real tragedy was taking place in a sterile medical clinic in Los Angeles, far away from the cameras. It is a chapter of Judy Garland's life that is often whispered about, but rarely confronted with the brutality it deserves. It was the moment Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer stopped being merely an employer and became an executioner of life itself. In July 1941, attempting to build a life outside the studio walls, reeling from the humiliation of the Artie Shaw debacle and the grueling production of Ziegfeld Girl, Judy eloped. She married David Rose, a musician and composer. He was kind, he was talented, and crucially, he was not Artie Shaw. For Judy, this marriage was a declaration of independence. It was proof that she was not just a little hunchback or a pudgy kid. She was a woman, a wife, someone worthy of a ring. And then the miracle happened. Judy Garland found out she was pregnant. For a 19-year-old girl who had been told her entire life that she was physically inadequate, this pregnancy was a revelation. It was biological proof that her body worked. It was proof that she was capable of creating something that wasn't a movie, something that Louis B. Mayer didn't own, something that wouldn't disappear when the director yelled, "Cut!" She was ecstatic. For the first time in years, the hunger in her stomach wasn't from starvation, it was from life. She imagined a nursery. She imagined a baby who would love her without conditions, without reviews, without box office receipts. But in the feudal system of MGM, a star's body is corporate property. The reproductive system of Judy Garland was not hers to control. It was an asset on the studio's balance sheet. When Judy broke the news to her mother, Ethel Gum, the real Wicked Witch of the West, as she should be known to history, there was no celebration. There were no tears of joy. Ethel Gum didn't see a grandchild. She saw a breach of contract. She immediately called the studio. The meeting that followed functioned as a sentencing hearing. Louis B. Mayer, the man who claimed to be Judy's father, joined forces with her biological mother to deliver the verdict. The logic was cold, corporate, and irrefutable. "Judy," they explained, "you are the girl next door. You are a child in the eyes of the public. Children do not have children." They argued that a pregnancy would destroy her innocent brand. They argued that taking time off to carry the baby would cost the studio millions in delayed productions. They argued that the public wasn't ready to see Dorothy Gale change in diapers. But the cruelty went deeper. They attacked her fitness as a mother. They pointed to the pills, the very pills they had prescribed her. "Look at you," Mayer effectively said. "You're a mess. You're an addict. You can't raise a child. You'll kill it." It was the ultimate gaslighting. They had broken her, and now they were using her brokenness as the justification to deny her the one thing that might have healed her. Judy fought. She pleaded. She cried. She turned to her husband, David Rose, for support, but Rose, intimidated by the titanic power of Mayer and the ferocity of Ethel, crumbled. He sided with the studio. He told her it wasn't the right time. He told her there would be other babies. He was wrong. There would be other babies years later, but there would never be this baby. This was the baby that represented her first grasp at normalcy. The procedure was arranged with the efficiency of a reshoot. Judy was taken to a private location without counseling or comfort. It was a medical erasure. While the physical pain was significant, the psychological impact was permanent. As the pregnancy was terminated, something inside Judy calcified. She realized with a terrifying clarity that she was a slave. Her body existed solely to serve the image on the screen. The Judy Garland the world loved was a vampire that fed on the real Frances Gum. She went home to an empty house. The nursery she had imagined turned back into a guest room. The silence was deafening. And in that silence, the voice of Artie Shaw, the voice of Louis B. Mayer, the voice of the critics, they all merged into a single screaming chorus. You are not a woman, you are a product. The only way to drown out the chorus was to numb the brain. The benzodrine usage skyrocketed. The seconal doses doubled. Judy wasn't taking drugs to get high anymore. She was taking them to mourn. She was grieving a ghost. And the studio, seeing her depression, simply adjusted the schedule and pushed her into the next musical number. Smile, Judy. The show must go on. While Judy was undergoing this private hell, the woman she had envied, the woman who had won, was discovering that her victory was a hollow joke. Lana Turner's marriage to Artie Shaw had imploded with the speed of a car crash. The elopement to Las Vegas, the thing that had shattered Judy's heart, turned out to be the prelude to a 4-month nightmare. Artie Shaw, the intellectual, revealed himself to be a domestic tyrant of the highest order. He didn't want a wife. He wanted a student he could fail. He treated Lana with a contempt that was breathtaking in its arrogance. He forbade her from wearing makeup in the house, telling her she looked cheap and vulgar with it on. He threw out her shoes because he decided they were trashy. He dictated her reading list, handing her dense philosophical texts and then humiliating her in front of their friends when she couldn't discuss Schopenhauer or Nietzsche. Lana Turner, the sex symbol of a generation, was reduced to a frightened schoolgirl in her own living room. She tried to please him. She tried to be the serious woman he claimed he wanted. She cooked for him badly. She scrubbed her face until it was raw. She stopped seeing her friends. But nothing was enough. Shaw was bored. He had conquered the mountain, and now he found the view uninspiring. He called her hot but immature. He told the press in thinly veiled comments that his wife was a beautiful idiot. The collapse came swiftly. 4 months after the wedding, it was over. Artie Shaw filed for divorce, or perhaps forced her to. He walked away from the wreckage without a backward glance, his reputation as a heartbreaker intact, his ego polished. Lana was left in the dust. The prize she had stolen from Judy turned out to be a box full of scorpions. She was 19 years old, divorced, humiliated, and publicly branded as a failure. The press, which had built up the Romeo and Juliet narrative, now delighted in tearing it down. Lana loses Artie, the headline screamed, with the subtext, see? Beauty isn't enough to keep a genius. The irony was grotesque. Judy Garland had lost her self-worth because Artie chose Lana. Lana Turner had lost her self-worth because Artie rejected Lana. Both women had been destroyed by the same man, yet they couldn't comfort each other. The wall of shame between them was too high. Judy couldn't call Lana and say, I know what it's like. Because to Judy, Lana's pain was the pain of a goddess falling to earth. To Lana, Judy's pain was invisible. The aftermath of these two events, the abortion and the divorce, created the psychological landscape for the rest of their lives. For Judy, the abortion confirmed her status as a victim of the system. She began to hate the studio with a visceral intensity. She hated Mayer. She hated her mother. But she turned that hatred inward. She punished her body because it had failed to protect her child. She punished her mind because it had failed to stand up to the men in suits. The addiction wasn't a habit. It was a form of slow-motion suicide. For Lana, the divorce hardened her. The soft, vulnerable girl from Idaho died in that marriage. In her place rose the Ice Maiden. Lana decided that if she couldn't be loved for her mind, she would weaponize her body. She would never let a man hurt her like that again. She would go on to marry 7 more times, but she would never again give her power away so completely. She became the Lana Turner of legend. Cold, glamorous, impenetrable. Mayer looked at the wreckage of 1941 and didn't see tragedy. He saw a clean slate. Judy was no longer pregnant. She was ready to film Babes on Broadway. Lana was no longer married. She was ready to be the single sex symbol again. The machine had corrected the errors. The product was back on the shelf. But deep within the studio, a new dynamic was forming. The rivalry was no longer about Artie Shaw. It was about survival. Judy watched Lana harden and thought, I wish I could be that cold. Lana watched Judy disintegrate and thought, I must never let them see me bleed like that. They were two sides of the same traumatized coin. And as 1941 bled into 1942, the world was at war. But the private war inside Judy Garland was just beginning to turn nuclear. She had lost her lover. She had lost her baby. All she had left was the pill bottle and the spotlight. And she would cling to both until they burned her alive. The abyss wasn't just a place they visited. It was where they lived. And the rent was paid in pieces of their soul, deducted weekly from their paychecks by the accounting department of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. The system had won. It had stripped them of their humanity and left only the icons. And as history shows us, icons are very easy to break, but impossible to put back together. By 1942, the war in Europe was consuming the world, but inside the sound stages of Culver City, a different kind of war was entering its attrition phase. The rivalry between Judy Garland and Lana Turner had evolved. It was no longer a sharp, jagged conflict over a man. It had become a chronic, systemic condition, like a low-grade fever that never breaks. They were no longer fighting each other directly. Instead, they were fighting the caricatures of themselves that Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer had etched into the public consciousness. For Judy, the cost of winning the role of Hollywood's greatest musical asset was the complete surrender of her biological autonomy. The pills were no longer a helper or a pick-me-up. They had become the metronome of her existence. Her life was measured not in hours or days, but in the colorful capsules that dictated her reality. Imagine the daily rhythm of this existence. It begins before dawn. The alarm rings in a house that feels more like a dormitory than a home. Judy wakes up, but she is not truly awake. Her body is heavy, filled with the leaden residue of last night's Seconal, the barbiturate prescribed to knock her unconscious after an 18-hour day. She is groggy. Her limbs feel disconnected from her brain, a sensation she described as wading through mud. To function, to even stand up, she requires the counter-agent. Enter the benzodrine, the bolts, the speed. Within 20 minutes of swallowing the amphetamines, the mud vanishes. In its place comes a terrifying, artificial clarity. Her heart begins to hammer against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat that mimics the sensation of panic. Her hands stop trembling, and start vibrating with a frequency that the camera reads as energy. Her eyes widen, the pupils dilating until they are black pools that catch every studio light. She is ready. She is Judy. But this chemical toggling, up, down, was wreaking havoc on her nervous system. By 1943, Judy Garland was no longer just a talented girl. She was an exposed nerve. She was hallucinating. She began to hear voices in the hum of the studio air conditioning. She saw judgment in the eyes of the extras. Paranoia became her constant companion. She believed, with a terrifying certainty, that she was being watched, that Mayer had spies in the walls, that the makeup artists were whispering about her pores, that the costume designers were laughing at her waistline. And the tragedy was, she wasn't entirely wrong. Mayer did have spies. The studio was monitoring her. They tracked her weight down to the ounce. If she gained 2 pounds, the commissary was notified. If she looked tired, the dosage was adjusted. They were treating a human being with the same mechanical detachment one would use to calibrate a lens. While Judy was vibrating apart, Lana Turner was freezing over. The aftermath of the Artie Shaw disaster had taught Lana a brutal lesson. Vulnerability is a death sentence. The sweater girl decided that if the world only wanted her surface, she would make that surface impenetrable. She began to construct the persona of Lana Turner as a suit of armor. She perfected the icy stare. She mastered the art of the aloof smile. She moved through the studio lot like a statue being transported between museums, beautiful, cold, and untouchable. Lana's cost was isolation. She became the woman other women didn't trust and men were terrified to approach. She married again to Stephen Crane in 1942. Then she divorced him. Then she remarried him. Then she divorced him again. It wasn't about love anymore. It was about filling the silence. She was terrified of being alone in a room with her own thoughts, because her thoughts inevitably drifted back to the fact that she was a high school dropout who had been traded like a playing card by Artie Shaw. The contrast between the two women in the mid-1940s was stark. Judy was the fire that was burning the house down. Lana was the ice that kept the structure standing but killed everything inside it. Then came Meet Me in St. Louis, 1944. This film is often cited as Judy's masterpiece, a technicolor dream of American nostalgia. But look closer at the face on the screen. This is where the physical transformation of Judy Garland becomes undeniable. She is 22 years old, but her eyes hold the ancient, haunted look of a combat veteran. The director, Vincente Minnelli, fell in love with her during the production. But Minnelli, for all his genius, was an aesthete. He loved beauty. He loved artifice. He looked at Judy and decided to fix her. He brought in a new makeup team. They reshaped her upper lip with prosthetics and liner to hide the gumminess. They contoured her nose. They changed her hairline. They lit her with soft filters to blur the exhaustion etched into her skin. Judy looked in the mirror and didn't recognize herself. She saw a beautiful stranger. Minnelli told her she was beautiful. The critics told her she was beautiful. But deep down, the little hunchback was screaming. She felt like a fraud. She felt that this new beauty was just another mask, another layer of paint to cover the rot. She married Minnelli in 1945, hoping that his love would validate this new version of herself. But you cannot marry your way out of addiction. By 1946, during the filming of The Pirate and The Harvey Girls, the system began to buckle. The human body has limits. The amphetamines were no longer producing euphoria. They were producing psychosis. Judy began to miss days of filming. She would lock herself in her dressing room, paralyzed, by a nameless terror. She would show up hours late, shaking, unable to remember her lines. The studio's reaction was not compassion, it was calculation. They suspended her. They docked her pay. They sent her angry letters reminding her of how much money she was costing the shareholders. Mayer called her into his office, not to help, but to scream. "You ungrateful brat," became the refrain. "After everything I made you." They brought in psychiatrists, studio-approved doctors who didn't listen to her trauma but simply prescribed more pills to manage the anxiety caused by the previous pills. It was a closed loop of malpractice. The breaking point arrived in 1947. It is a moment that should be etched in the history of labor rights, not just Hollywood lore. Judy Garland, the biggest star in the world, the girl who sang "Over the Rainbow," walked into her bathroom. She looked at the reflection that Minnelli had redesigned, that Mayer had starved, that the world claimed to love. She picked up a piece of broken glass. This was not necessarily a wish for death, but a desperate attempt to stop the noise. She injured her throat with the glass, a wound not deep enough to end her life, but deep enough to scream. The studio's response to this event is the ultimate indictment of the system. They didn't call an ambulance immediately. They called publicity. They called the fixers. The story was buried. The press was told she was exhausted. They patched her up, put makeup over the scar, or kept her in high collars, and eventually they put her back to work. Lana Turner heard about it. The news traveled through the grapevine of the elites. Imagine Lana sitting in her mansion, perhaps looking at a script for The Postman Always Rings Twice. She hears that Judy, the talent, the genius, the one she envied, tried to kill herself. Did she call? Did she rush to the hospital? History suggests she didn't. Not because she didn't care, but because the terror was too close. To acknowledge Judy's breakdown was to acknowledge the fragility of their entire existence. If Judy Garland, the one with the talent, could break, what chance did Lana Turner, the one with just the face, have? Lana retreated further into her shell. She became harder, sharper. She threw herself into the role of the femme fatale. In The Postman Always Rings Twice, 1946, Lana plays a woman who is visually perfect but morally dead, a woman who destroys everything she touches. It was the performance of her life because it wasn't acting. It was the armor protecting the scared girl from Idaho. By the late 1940s, the cost was clear. Judy Garland had paid for her fame with her sanity. She was now a problem star. She was branded unreliable. The very addiction the studio had installed in her was now being used as the reason to fire her. She was a liability. The asset had depreciated. Lana Turner had paid for her fame with her humanity. She was a star, but she was alone. She was rich, but she was emotionally bankrupt. She was the goddess, but she was trapped in a temple where the worshipers only loved the statue, not the woman inside it. The rivalry was over. There was no winner. There were only two survivors of a plane crash, wandering in different directions through the same jungle. Judy was heading toward a total collapse that would see her fired from MGM in 1950, the ultimate betrayal by the father who claimed to love her. Lana was heading toward a life of scandal, violence, and a desperate search for a man who could see past the platinum hair. But before the final curtain of the MGM era fell, there was one last twist, one last realization that the sin of being ordinary wasn't Judy's sin at all. It was the studio's sin. They were the ones who were ordinary men with ordinary greed, terrified of the extraordinary women they had enslaved. And like all ordinary men faced with something they cannot control, they decided to destroy it. The 1940s ended not with a bang, but with the sound of a pill bottle rattling in an empty room and the silence of a telephone that never rang, with the apology both women were waiting for. In the 1950s, a strange and poignant coda occurred. Fate placed them as neighbors in Holmby Hills. On one side of the hedge was Judy Garland's house, chaotic, warm, and unstable. On the other was Lana Turner's fortress, pristine, silent, and terrifyingly ordered. They exchanged pleasantries across the driveway, but never crossed the line. They were mirrors reflecting each other's brokenness. Judy saw the perfection she starved for. Lana saw the raw emotion she repressed. Judy Garland spent the rest of her life trying to transmute pain into art, delivering concerts that felt like exorcisms, but the applause couldn't silence the quiet of the hotel rooms. She died in London in 1969 at 47, her body worn out by the chemical metronome Mayer had started 3 decades earlier. Lana Turner survived. She lived to be 75, maintaining the facade until the end. When asked about Judy years later, Lana didn't use the competitive language of the studio. She simply said she was the galaxy. It was an admission that while Lana had won the survival game, Judy had possessed the spark of life that no studio polish could manufacture. Ultimately, the unforgivable sin of being ordinary was nothing more than a studio fabrication. The system ground human hope into entertainment, turning friends into weapons against one another. Artie Shaw lived to be 94, viewing them as mere footnotes. Yet in the historical record, he remains the footnote to the 2 women he tried to destroy. In our next chapter, Legendary Stories peels back the curtain on Vivian Leigh and Marilyn Monroe. When the 2 greatest sex symbols of the century were driven to their graves by an isolation so profound, their cries for help went unanswered. Were they truly mad women? Or were they simply victims of a world that forbade a goddess from being human? Subscribe now and join us as we uncover the answer.